3 teenage girls, a secret plan, and a betrayal so cold it shocked the nation. What led 2 best friends to lure a bright 16-year-old into the woods and murder her? This isn't just a true crime story. It's a chilling reminder that evil can wear the face of friendship. Watch till the end. Skylar Neese was a bright, driven 16-year-old honors student living in Star City, West Virginia. She was known for her intelligence, quick wit, and a strong sense of ambition. With dreams of becoming a criminal defense lawyer, Skylar had a clear path laid out for herself. She loved to read, enjoyed school, and maintained a close relationship with her parents, Mary and Dave Neese. Like many teenagers, Skylar also valued her friendships, especially with her 2 best friends, Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Shalia Eddy, also 16, had been Skylar's best friend since childhood. They met early in school and bonded over shared interests, becoming practically inseparable. Shalia lived in nearby Morgantown and was outgoing, confident, and charismatic. Rachel Schoaf, another 16-year-old from Morgantown, joined their circle a bit later. She was more reserved and came from a religious family. Together, the 3 formed a close-knit group at university, high school. They spent weekends together, had countless sleepovers, and shared their lives online through social media. For a while, everything seemed normal. Just 3 teenage girls enjoying their friendship. But over time, cracks began to show. Skylar began noticing changes in the dynamic. Shalia and Rachel were growing closer, often leaving her out of conversations and plans. Skylar, who had always been at the center of the trio, was slowly being pushed out. The emotional toll on her was clear in the cryptic tweets she began posting. Messages like, "Sick of being at the end of the rope. You're only my friend when it's convenient," gave glimpses into her emotional state. Another post read, "You doing something like that is why I will never completely trust you." These weren't just teenage frustrations. They were signs of a growing rift that no one outside their circle fully understood. Behind the scenes, something much darker was unfolding. Shalia and Rachel weren't just drifting away from Skylar. They were actively planning her murder. According to Rachel's later confession, they had simply grown tired of her. The tension and arguments had reached a point where they no longer wanted her in their lives. But rather than cutting ties or seeking help, they chose violence. The decision was cold and calculated. Weeks before the murder, the 2 girls began planning. They gathered supplies: kitchen knives, cleaning materials, towels, and a shovel. They talked about how and when they would do it. The plan was straightforward in their minds: lure Skylar out, take her to a remote area, and kill her. It was as if they were preparing for an errand, not the brutal ending of a life. On the night of July 5, 2012, the plan was set into motion. Earlier that evening, Skylar returned home from work at a local fast food restaurant. Around midnight, she quietly slipped out of her bedroom window, her purse over her shoulder, and climbed into the back seat of Shalia's car. She thought they were going for a late-night joyride, something they had done before. There was no reason not to trust them. They had been her best friends. The girls drove across the state line into Pennsylvania, eventually reaching a remote wooded area in Wayne Township, Greene County. It was a place they had visited before, familiar and quiet, perfect for what they had planned. Once there, they got out of the car and began talking, pretending everything was normal. Then, on the signal on 3, both Shalia and Rachel pulled out their knives and began stabbing Skylar. Skylar fought back. She managed to break free for a moment, running toward the woods. But she was quickly caught. The attack continued until she collapsed. In total, Skylar was stabbed more than 50 times. When the violence finally stopped, the girls stood over her body, covered in blood. They tried to dig a hole to bury her, but the ground was too hard. Instead, they dragged her body to a nearby tree and covered it with branches, rocks, and dirt. They left her there and drove home. Back in Star City, Skylar's parents woke up the next morning to find her missing. Her window was open and her bed empty. Her father, Dave, knew right away something was wrong. Skylar never ran away. She was responsible and always came home. They reported her missing immediately. At first, the police treated the case as a possible runaway. Skylar was a teenager, after all, and the assumption was that she had left on her own and would return soon. But surveillance footage told a different story. A security camera outside the Nice home showed Skylar getting into a car at around 12:30 a.m. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed her willingly getting into the back seat of a vehicle. Her parents didn't recognize the car, and investigators began digging deeper. In the days and weeks that followed, Shalia Eddy played the part of a concerned friend. She tweeted about how much she missed Skylar and even helped the Nice family distribute missing posters. She acted devastated in public and never gave any indication of guilt. Rachel, on the other hand, began to crumble under the pressure. As months passed, her behavior became more erratic. She withdrew from school, isolated herself, and appeared visibly anxious. The weight of the secret was beginning to crush her. Authorities began to suspect that Skylar's disappearance was not a runaway case. The lack of activity on her bank account and phone and her failure to contact anyone raised red flags. Interviews with friends and classmates revealed the growing tension between Skylar and her two friends. But without a body or a confession, police had little concrete evidence. Then came the turning point. In December 2012, Rachel suffered a severe emotional breakdown. Her mental state had deteriorated to the point where her parents took her to a psychiatric facility. On January 3, 2013, just days after being released, Rachel broke. She confessed to the murder. In a detailed interview with investigators, she told them everything: how she and Shalia planned the murder, how they executed it, and where they had left Skylar's body. It was the breakthrough the case needed. But what came next would only deepen the tragedy. When Rachel Schoaf confessed to the murder on January 3, 2013, it marked a major shift in the investigation. Until that moment, Skylar Nice's disappearance had remained a haunting mystery. For months, her parents had held on to hope that their daughter was alive somewhere, perhaps scared, perhaps hiding, but still out there. Rachel's admission shattered that hope. She told police exactly what happened the night Skylar died and where they had left her body. Her confession was chilling not just for its content, but for the calm, matter-of-fact way she delivered it. After speaking with investigators, Rachel led them to the remote area in Wayne Township, Greene County, Pennsylvania, just across the West Virginia border. The location was heavily wooded and isolated, far from any homes or businesses. Though 6 months had passed, her memory of the site was clear. When investigators arrived at the scene with her, the grim reality began to unfold. In that quiet patch of woods, under a thin layer of rocks, dirt, and decaying branches, they found human remains. A few weeks later, on March 13, 2013, those remains were positively identified through dental records as Skylar Nice. For Skylar's parents, Mary and Dave Nice, the confirmation was devastating. They had spent nearly 9 months searching, posting flyers, speaking to media outlets, and pleading for information. The idea that their daughter had been brutally murdered by her closest friends, girls who had shared dinner in their home, who had laughed and taken pictures with Skylar, was unthinkable. But now, with the confession and the discovery of the body, there was no doubt. Rachel's cooperation gave law enforcement a clear understanding of the crime. She admitted that she and Shalia had planned Skylar's murder well in advance. They chose a night when Skylar wouldn't be missed right away, packed their weapons and supplies, and picked her up under the pretense of a late-night hangout. Rachel even recalled the specific moment they attacked her, counting 1, 2, 3, before lunging forward with their knives. The cruelty and premeditation stunned investigators. With Rachel in custody, attention turned immediately to Shalia Eddy. Though she had continued to act innocent in public, tweeting about missing Skylar, attending school events, and even spending time with Skylar's parents, her mask was starting to slip. Investigators already suspected her involvement, and now, with Rachel's full statement, they had the evidence to prove it. Still, authorities moved carefully. They needed to build a case strong enough to secure a conviction. Over the following weeks and months, they quietly gathered more information. They analyzed phone records, recovered deleted messages, and interviewed classmates and others close to the girls. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Shalia and Rachel had shared private conversations, even jokes, about the murder. One message from Shalia to Rachel shortly after the killing read, "We really did go on 3." Meanwhile, Rachel was cooperating fully. Her confession was part of a plea deal. She had agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for her testimony against Shalia. Rachel appeared remorseful during interviews and court appearances. While many questioned how someone could be involved in such a crime at all, her cooperation played a key role in moving the case forward. Shalia, in contrast, remained stone-faced and uncooperative. She returned to school and acted as if nothing had happened. Her social media continued as usual, filled with teenage updates, song lyrics, and occasional vague posts about betrayal and trust. For outsiders, it was confusing. For those who knew the truth, it was haunting. Behind the carefully crafted image, she had committed an unthinkable act and showed no signs of regret. By the time summer 2013 arrived, law enforcement had enough evidence to proceed. They arrested Shalia Eddy on September 4, 2013, charging her with first-degree murder. The arrest was made without warning. Shalia had just pulled into a restaurant parking lot with her mother when she was taken into custody. The news spread quickly, and the public reaction was immediate. Many had suspected Shalia's involvement, but seeing her arrested confirmed what had long been feared. Back in Star City, the community was left grappling with the full scope of the crime. University High School, where all 3 girls had once studied together, became a symbol of confusion and sadness. Teachers, classmates, and neighbors struggled to understand how such a brutal act could have been committed by seemingly ordinary teenagers. There were no obvious signs, no dramatic warnings. The murder wasn't tied to drugs, gangs, or abuse. It was something even harder to explain, something rooted in jealousy, peer pressure, and emotional instability. As the legal process continued, Skylar's family fought for justice. They worked closely with state lawmakers to create Skylar's Law, a bill that changed how the state responded to missing child cases. Under the new law, an Amber Alert-like system would be activated immediately if a child was missing and believed to be in danger, regardless of whether the child was considered a runaway. The legislation was passed unanimously, ensuring that other families would receive a faster, more urgent response in future cases. In the months following the arrests, more details about the girls' motives and personalities began to surface. While the official reason given for the murder was simply that they didn't want to be friends with Skylar anymore, investigators and psychologists offered deeper insights. The girls had become emotionally entangled, with Rachel and Shalia forming a bond that excluded Skylar. There were rumors of jealousy, romantic tension, and manipulation, suggesting that the friendship had turned toxic long before the murder was planned. But even with those theories, the brutality of the act remained difficult to comprehend. The case drew national attention. News outlets across the country covered the story, and it became a topic of debate among true crime communities. How could 2 teenage girls plan and carry out the murder of their best friend? What warning signs were missed? And could anything have been done to stop it? As Shalia awaited trial, Rachel remained in custody. Her cooperation meant that she wouldn't face a first-degree murder charge, but her role in the killing was undeniable. Both girls had taken part in the stabbing. Both had left Skylar to die alone in the woods. The justice system would now determine their fate. By early 2014, the courtroom would become the final stage for the story. Rachel would stand before a judge and admit her guilt publicly. Shalia would eventually be forced to do the same. The details of the murder would be laid bare, and for the first time, the full truth would be spoken aloud. On May 1, 2013, nearly 10 months after Skylar Neese was murdered, Rachel Schoaf stood in front of a Monongalia County Circuit Court judge and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Her voice was steady but low as she admitted to taking part in the stabbing death of her best friend. She told the court, "We just didn't like her anymore." It was a short, cold explanation for an act that was both horrifying and senseless. With her plea, Rachel formally accepted responsibility and agreed to testify against Shalia Eddy, her co-conspirator and once closest friend. The public response to Rachel's plea was a mix of disbelief and anger. The motive seemed shallow, unfathomable. Skylar Neese had been targeted and killed not out of self-defense, not for money, but simply because her two friends had decided they no longer wanted her around. There were no complex criminal backgrounds, no history of abuse or mental illness that would explain the violence. Just two teenage girls making a plan and following through. In the months that followed Rachel's plea, Shalia Eddy's case moved slowly through the legal system. She initially pleaded not guilty, and for a time, it appeared she would go to trial. Prosecutors were ready to present Rachel's testimony, physical evidence, and a detailed timeline of events. Investigators had uncovered messages between Shalia and Rachel that hinted at their guilt, including conversations that made light of what they'd done. The prosecution's case was solid. Then, unexpectedly, Shalia changed course. On January 24, 2014, she stood in court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. At just 18 years old, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. During the sentencing, Shalia remained expressionless. Unlike Rachel, who showed visible emotion and remorse during her appearances, Shalia offered no apology, no explanation. Her silence only deepened the pain for Skylar's family. Rachel Schoaf was sentenced a few months later. In February 2014, she received 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. When she addressed the court during sentencing, she broke down in tears. She apologized to Skylar's parents and admitted her role in the crime. The judge noted her cooperation with authorities and the emotional toll the crime had taken on her, but emphasized the gravity of what she had done. "You murdered your friend," he said. A cold, calculated, planned act. With both girls behind bars, the legal chapter of Skylar's case came to a close. But the emotional aftermath would linger far longer. For Mary and Dave Neese, the loss of their only child was a wound that time could never fully heal. They had trusted Shalia and Rachel. They had welcomed them into their home. To learn that the very girls who once sat on their couch, laughing and joking with Skylar, had been plotting her death was beyond comprehension. Skylar's story drew national attention not only for its brutality, but for the questions it raised about teenage behavior, mental health, and the invisible pressures within adolescent friendships. There were no outward signs that something was wrong, no clear warnings that could have predicted what would happen. All three girls had come from middle-class families. They were honor students. They posted selfies and quotes on Twitter. They had dreams of college, futures ahead of them. But beneath that surface, something toxic had grown unchecked. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was how normal everything appeared from the outside. After the murder, both Shalia and Rachel went back to school. They smiled in pictures. Shalia, in particular, continued to tweet about missing Skylar, even retweeting posts from the Neese family pleading for help. She kept up the lie for months, long after Skylar had been left to die in the woods. It was a level of deception that shocked not only investigators, but everyone who knew her. The story forced communities to ask hard questions. How do friendships between teenagers sour to such a dangerous extent? Could anyone have intervened sooner? Was there something missed in their behavior, their social media, their school life? For parents, teachers, and peers, the case became a grim reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how quickly things can spiral out of control when emotions are left unchecked. Skylar's legacy would go on to impact more than just those who knew her personally. In response to her disappearance and the slow response from authorities, West Virginia passed Skylar's Law in 2013. The law requires law enforcement to issue a public alert immediately for any child reported missing, even if the case is initially classified as a runaway. It ensured that families in similar situations wouldn't face the same delays Skylar's parents did. Her name became tied to meaningful change, a small measure of justice in the wake of tragedy. Behind bars, Rachel Schoaf and Shalia Eddy live out the consequences of their actions. As of now, both remain incarcerated. Rachel is eligible for parole in 2024, while Shalia must wait until at least 2029. Whether they will ever walk free remains uncertain. What is certain is the life they took, Skylar's life, was full of promise, stolen long before it ever had a chance to unfold. The murder of Skylar Neese remains one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases of teen violence in recent memory. It was a betrayal in its purest form, an act of cruelty carried out by the very people she trusted the most. What makes the story linger is not just the crime itself, but how quietly it was planned, how calmly it was carried out, and how coldly it was covered up. In the end, Skylar Neese's death became more than just another tragic headline. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can exist behind even the most familiar faces. And while justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional scars left behind by that July night in 2012 continue to mark the hearts of those who loved her. A smart, kind, and ambitious young girl lost her life not to strangers, but to her best friends. And that betrayal, above all else, is what continues to haunt the story of Skylar Neese. In a quiet Texas town, a loving family was brutally attacked in the dead of night. The killers? Not strangers, but led by their own teenage daughter. What drove a 16-year-old to plot her family's murder? Uncover the chilling truth behind the Caffey family murders. This is a story you won't forget. Alba, Texas. A quiet, rural town with a population small enough that most people know each other by name. In early 2008, nothing about this sleepy East Texas community hinted at what was coming. But in the early hours of March 1st, the town was rocked by an act so violent, so unexpected, it would leave a permanent scar. The Caffey family murders. At the center of it all was a 16-year-old high school girl named Erin Caffey. Blonde, quiet, and raised in a religious home, Erin was the kind of girl most parents would consider responsible and respectful. Her father, Terry Caffey, was a devoted Christian and a family man. He worked in ministry and loved playing guitar in church. Her mother, Penny, a homemaker, was known for her warmth and her dedication to her children. The Caffey household was seen by many as wholesome, rooted in strong values and Christian discipline. Erin had two younger brothers, 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler, both bright, active boys with their lives ahead of them. But things started to shift when Erin met 18-year-old Charlie Wilkinson. Charlie was older, jobless, and not considered a good influence by the Caffey parents. He had dropped out of high school and spent most of his time with friends, drinking and doing little else. Despite his flaws, Erin fell hard for him. Their relationship intensified quickly. Late-night phone calls turned into secret meetings, and emotions began running deep, too deep for a teenage romance. Terry and Penny soon realized something wasn't right. They began setting rules. No more seeing Charlie. No more calls. No more rebellion. But instead of pulling back, Erin pushed harder. Her anger toward her parents began to build. Every time they told her no, it fanned the flames of resentment. In her teenage mind, her parents weren't trying to protect her. They were the enemy, keeping her from love. Charlie wasn't alone either. He had friends who didn't mind getting into trouble. One of them was Charles Wade, a 20-year-old with a criminal record and a reputation for being reckless. Charles's girlfriend, 18-year-old Bobby Johnson, was often around too, quiet, observant, and eager to follow the group. Somewhere in the middle of teenage frustration and reckless infatuation, an unthinkable idea took shape. If Erin's parents were out of the way, no one could stop her and Charlie from being together. The murder plot didn't come out of nowhere. It simmered for weeks. Erin had complained to Charlie about how strict her parents were. She told him she hated living under their rules. And Charlie, who'd often spoken about doing anything for Erin, didn't back down when the idea of murder was raised. Whether it started as a joke or a fantasy, at some point the idea became real. Erin reportedly told Charlie that if he really loved her, he'd do this for her. Charlie brought Charles Wade into the plan, promising money and support. Charles didn't ask many questions. With his girlfriend Bobby by his side, he agreed to help. The four of them began making preparations, when to go, how to get in, and what weapons to bring. It was all laid out. Erin would stay in the car. The others would do the rest. In the early hours of March 1st, 2008, the plan went into motion. Erin snuck out of her house and met Charlie, Charles, and Bobby. They drove to the Caffey home, arriving around 1:50 a.m. It was a chilly night. The house sat quietly among the trees. No signs of trouble. No screams. Just the stillness of a family asleep, unaware of the horror about to unfold. Charlie and Charles entered the house first. They were armed, 2 guns and a sword. Charles wore gloves. Charlie carried rage. Penny was the first to be attacked. She was shot in the head and stabbed multiple times with the sword. The attackers moved quickly and methodically. Matthew, just 13, was shot in the face as he tried to escape. Tyler, the youngest, was found in his bed. He was stabbed repeatedly, so violently that the knife broke. Terry Caffey was shot 5 times, in the head, shoulder, and back. Bleeding, barely conscious, he managed to survive the attack. Somehow, despite the pain, he crawled out of a bathroom window and dragged himself through the woods. He crawled over 300 yards to a neighbor's house. His face was unrecognizable from the injuries, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. But he lived, and he remembered everything. Meanwhile, after the attack, Charlie and Charles set the house on fire to destroy the evidence. Flames began to consume the home, hiding the gruesome scene beneath the ashes. They returned to the car, where Erin and Bobby were waiting. The group drove away as the fire burned, leaving behind what they thought was a completed job. No witnesses, no survivors. But Terry's survival changed everything. By the time emergency services arrived, the Caffey home was engulfed. Firefighters found the bodies of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler inside. The scene was chaotic. Investigators were stunned not only by the brutality, but by the calculated nature of the crime. This wasn't a random act. It was personal. And it didn't take long for things to unravel. Terry, from his hospital bed, told police what he remembered. He had seen the shooter. He knew it was Charlie Wilkinson, his daughter's boyfriend. That single detail gave investigators a direction. Within hours, authorities located Charlie at his trailer. And there they found Erin. She was alive, unharmed, and strangely calm. That raised more questions than answers. Why wasn't she at home during the attack? Why was she hiding with the prime suspect? Police began their interviews. At first, Erin claimed she had no idea what happened. She said she had snuck out to be with Charlie, unaware of any plan. But the story didn't hold. As detectives pressed her, Erin's mask started to crack. She grew emotional. Eventually, she confessed. She had known everything. She had planned it. She had asked Charlie to kill her family. Her confession shocked everyone involved. A 16-year-old girl, raised in a stable Christian home, had orchestrated the murder of her own family over a teenage relationship. It didn't seem real, but the evidence was undeniable. All 4 teens were arrested within hours. Charges followed quickly. The community of Alba, Texas, was left stunned, asking the same question over and over. Why? In the hours following the arrests, the small town of Alba struggled to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. People who had known the Caffey family personally found themselves asking how something this horrific could be born from their community, from a girl they'd seen singing in church, from teenagers they'd passed in grocery store aisles or at school events. But behind closed doors at the sheriff's department, the focus had shifted to building a complete picture of the crime, every detail, every motive, every voice involved. Investigators began formal interviews with the 4 teens. Erin Caffey, Charlie Wilkinson, Charles Wade, and Bobby Johnson. At first, there was confusion and denial. But the more the detectives pressed, the faster the cracks began to show. Charlie was the first to speak openly. He admitted he had gone to the Caffey house. He admitted he'd taken part in the killings. He didn't try to hide it. In fact, he told officers that everything had been Erin's idea. According to him, she was the one who asked for it. She was the one who wanted her parents dead. Charles Wade, who had a history of run-ins with the law, also confessed. He detailed how he had stood by while Charlie attacked Penny and the boys, and how he helped set the fire that destroyed the house. He said he was promised money and was told it was a necessary step so Charlie and Aaron could be together. Bobby Johnson admitted she had driven with them to the house and waited in the car with Aaron as the murders happened inside. Each confession filled in another piece of the puzzle, but it was Aaron's interview that left investigators and prosecutors shaken. She was cold at first, quiet, defensive, and guarded. But over the course of questioning, her story came out. Aaron had not only known about the plan, she had helped design it. She admitted she had been angry at her parents for trying to separate her from Charlie. She said they treated her like a child and didn't respect her feelings. In her words, they were trying to ruin her life. She felt trapped, and in her mind, there was only one way out. Her confessions painted a disturbing picture. A teenager who felt so consumed by anger and emotion that she convinced others to carry out something irreversible. There was no evidence she ever physically took part in the murders, but there was overwhelming proof that she had emotionally driven them. She had told Charlie again and again that she wanted her parents gone. She had cried, screamed, and manipulated him until he finally agreed to do it. What shocked investigators even more was her emotional detachment when talking about her younger brothers. She admitted knowing they would be killed too. Her only concern, it seemed, was whether she would ever see Charlie again. Law enforcement pieced together a timeline. The four teens had planned the attack for nearly a month. On the night of the murders, Aaron had snuck out of the house and met the others at a nearby location. From there, they drove to the Caffey residence. Aaron waited in the car with Bobby Johnson. Charlie and Charles Wade entered the house. The plan was brutal and direct. Kill everyone inside. Remove the obstacles. Set the house on fire. Disappear. The murder weapons were recovered. The sword used on Penny and Tyler. The guns used to shoot Matthew and Terry. Physical evidence backed up every part of the story. Phone records showed months of text messages between Aaron and Charlie, many of which hinted at their anger toward her family. One message, discovered later, simply read, "You ready to get this over with?" Charlie had responded, "I'll do anything for you." Meanwhile, Terry Caffey remained in the hospital, recovering from 5 gunshot wounds and burns. Despite the trauma, he remained lucid and alert. His first-hand account became the foundation of the prosecution's case. He had seen Charlie's face. He remembered the screams. He remembered the fire. But what stunned him more than the physical pain was the truth that came after, that his daughter had planned it all. When investigators confirmed that Aaron was involved, they approached Terry with the news. The man who had lost his wife and 2 sons in a single night was now being told that his only surviving child was responsible. His response was one of devastation. Not rage, just heartbreak. He told authorities, "I don't want to believe it. But if she did this, then I want the truth." Media coverage quickly picked up the story. A small Texas town, a family slaughtered, and a teenage daughter behind it all. It captured national attention. News crews arrived in Alba. Interviews were requested. The courtroom began to fill. And for the prosecutors, the challenge was clear. How to charge 4 young people, all under 21, for a crime that was both shocking and premeditated. Due to the nature of the case, all 4 suspects were charged with capital murder. But this wasn't a simple courtroom battle. The legal teams began discussing plea deals, possible testimonies, and how each individual's role would be treated. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade, the 2 who had entered the home and committed the murders, faced the harshest consequences. Prosecutors announced they would not seek the death penalty, but would push for life without parole. Bobby Johnson, who had stayed in the car, became a key witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. Aaron's case was more complicated. She hadn't physically killed anyone, but her involvement was clear. She had orchestrated the event, pushed for it, encouraged it. Prosecutors had the texts, the confessions, and witness statements. There was no question that she was responsible, but the court would need to decide how responsible a 16-year-old girl could be. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Aaron as a manipulative teenager who had weaponized love and used others to carry out her plan. Others saw her as a broken girl, a child pushed to extremes by emotional distress. But no one could ignore the facts. 3 lives were gone. A house was reduced to ashes. And 4 young people were now facing the rest of their lives behind bars. In the lead up to the trials, the families of the victims and the accused were left to pick up the pieces. Terry Caffey moved away from Alba. He needed distance. His grief was too big for the small town that had once been his home. He eventually found a new place to live, but he carried the loss with him every day. He rarely spoke publicly during this time, but when he did, he focused on one thing: healing. The legal proceedings for the Caffey family murders began with intense scrutiny from the media, the public, and the grieving families. For young lives were now in the hands of the criminal justice system, each playing a different role in a crime that had shaken a community to its core. With the investigation concluded and all evidence pointing clearly to premeditated murder, the courts moved quickly to seek accountability. Charlie Wilkinson, 18 at the time of the murders, was the first to face judgment. His role in the killings was direct, undeniable, and brutal. He had pulled the trigger and wielded the sword. Prosecutors charged him with 3 counts of capital murder. During pretrial proceedings, Charlie showed little emotion. His own confession, given voluntarily, sealed his fate. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, he agreed to a plea deal that spared his life but sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. Charlie would never walk free again. Charles Wade, who was 20 at the time, also accepted a similar plea deal. Although he didn't pull the trigger or strike the final blows, he was a willing accomplice who entered the house, helped carry out the murders, and aided in setting the fire. He too was sentenced to life without parole. His girlfriend, Bobby Johnson, had played a lesser role. She remained in the car with Aaron during the attack, but she had been aware of the plan, had driven the others to the scene, and did nothing to stop it. In exchange for her cooperation with the prosecution, including testimony against the others, she received a 40-year prison sentence. Then came the most complex and emotionally charged case of all, Aaron Caffey. Just 16 at the time of the murders, Aaron had not lifted a weapon, not entered the house, and not committed the physical violence. Yet the evidence made it clear she had driven the plot. Her communications with Charlie, including months of messages and conversations, made her intent unmistakable. She had pushed the plan forward. She had waited in the getaway car. She had known her mother, father, and 2 young brothers would be killed, and she had done nothing to stop it. The court faced a difficult decision. Aaron was legally a minor, but the crime was one of the most disturbing the state had seen. Prosecutors argued that her level of involvement and emotional manipulation made her just as guilty as those who carried out the act. After reviewing all evidence, the court agreed. Aaron Caffey was charged as an adult and pleaded guilty to 3 counts of capital murder. In 2009, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 25 years, making her eligible for parole after 40 years. Inside the courtroom, Terry Caffey sat quietly, listening to every word. The man who had lost his wife, his 2 sons, and nearly his own life, now had to watch his only surviving child be led away in handcuffs. The pain he carried was visible. And yet, what made Terry's story even more profound was not just his survival. It was his choice to forgive. In the months following the murders, as he recovered physically and emotionally, Terry struggled with the impossible task of reconciling the daughter he had raised with the girl who had planned to have him killed. In interviews, he admitted to crying for hours, asking God why. But over time, he came to a place of forgiveness. He said he couldn't carry the weight of hate along with his grief. In a move that stunned many, Terry began visiting Aaron in prison. He told her he loved her. He wrote her letters. He believed that despite her actions, she was still his daughter. Terry eventually sold the land where his family home had once stood and moved away from Alba. The memories there were too heavy. He remarried and started a new chapter of life, though he never forgot the one he had lost. He later became a public speaker, sharing his story with churches, schools, and community groups. His message was one of warning, about the dangers of teen relationships that spiral out of control, about missed red flags, and about the power of forgiveness. He spoke not to excuse Aaron's actions, but to help others avoid similar tragedies. The town of Alba continued on, changed forever. People still spoke about the Caffey family in quiet tones. Matthew, the 13-year-old who loved music. Tyler, the youngest, full of life and curiosity. Penny, the mother who sang in church. Their memories were preserved by those who had known them. And every year, on the anniversary of the murders, a few families still left flowers at the site where the house once stood. As for Aaron, Charlie, Charles, and Bobby, they all remain in separate prisons across Texas. Decades remain before parole hearings can even begin, and for the two young men, the possibility of release does not exist. Time moves slowly behind prison walls, and the choices made that night in March 2008 follow them every day. The Caffey family murders are remembered not only for their brutality, but for how deeply personal the crime was. It wasn't committed by strangers. It wasn't driven by money, gang violence, or random chance. It was driven by emotion, by love twisted into obsession, by teenage defiance fueled by rebellion, and by choices that spun far out of control. It is a case that left many people asking not just how this could happen, but how anyone could miss the warning signs. In the end, the story of the Caffey family is one of tragedy, survival, and complexity. It shows the darkest corners of human behavior, even among the young. But it also shows the capacity of a father's heart to forgive the unforgivable. And in the long silence that followed the courtroom sentences, perhaps that was the most unexpected twist of all. In a quiet Missouri town, a 9-year-old girl vanished on her walk home, an ordinary evening shattered by an unthinkable crime. As search efforts unfolded, suspicion turned toward an unlikely suspect, a 15-year-old neighbor. What followed was a chilling discovery that would leave a community and the nation stunned beyond belief. In October 2009, the quiet town of St. Martin, Missouri, found itself at the center of a deeply disturbing case. It was a place where neighbors knew each other, children played outside freely, and crime was almost unheard of. But all of that changed one fall evening, when 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton vanished on her way home from a friend's house. Elizabeth was a soft-spoken fourth grader who loved stuffed animals, the color pink, and spending time with her family. On October 21st, at around 6:15 p.m., she left her friend's house just a few blocks away from her own. The walk was short, a path she had taken before, and there was no reason to believe she wouldn't make it back safely. But she never arrived home. When her mother realized she was late, panic set in quickly. This wasn't like Elizabeth. A missing person report was filed that same evening, and what began as a worried parent's worst fear quickly spiraled into a full-scale community search. Local law enforcement responded immediately. Officers, firefighters, and volunteers came together to look for the missing child. Search dogs were brought in, helicopters circled overhead, and neighbors combed through the wooded areas surrounding the homes. Flashlights lit up the night, and people called out Elizabeth's name, hoping she had simply gotten lost or wandered off. But as hours passed and no trace of her was found, hope began to fade. The community's fear deepened. Among the people helping with the search was a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Bustamante. She lived just a few houses away from the Olton family. To most people, Alyssa seemed like just another teenager, quiet, a bit withdrawn, but nothing alarming on the surface. She was a high school student living with her grandparents and 2 younger brothers. Her mother had a history of drug addiction, and her father was in prison. Because of this, her grandparents had taken legal custody of her, trying to provide a more stable home. But beneath the surface, Alyssa was deeply troubled. She had a long history of mental health issues, including depression and self-harm. She had previously attempted suicide and had been receiving therapy and medication. Her social media pages were filled with dark content, posts about pain, death, and sadness. She wrote poetry that often focused on violence and loss. Still, to many adults around her, it seemed like typical teen angst. No one imagined she was capable of anything beyond words. As the investigation continued, police began interviewing residents in the neighborhood. They spoke with friends, family members, and anyone who might have seen Elizabeth that day. Alyssa was questioned as well. At first, she gave vague answers, nothing that raised immediate red flags. But detectives noticed a few things that didn't sit right. Alyssa had scratches on her arms and seemed nervous. Her answers lacked consistency. When they asked if they could look through her personal belongings, her behavior grew more guarded. Investigators obtained permission to search the Bustamante home. What they found would turn the case in a chilling new direction. Inside Alyssa's bedroom, officers discovered journals, notebooks, and drawings filled with violent thoughts. Her writings were dark and disturbing. Some even described killing someone just to know what it would feel like. But what stood out the most was a specific diary entry made on October 22nd, the day after Elizabeth disappeared. In it, Alyssa wrote about killing someone, describing the act in shocking detail, and even calling it pretty enjoyable. It ended with an eerie sentence, "Okay, I gotta go to church now, LOL." This was no longer a missing person case. The focus shifted entirely. Detectives brought Alyssa in for further questioning. This time, the conversation was different. Under pressure, and after several hours of interrogation, Alyssa broke. What she told them was beyond anything the community could have imagined. Alyssa confessed that 2 days before Elizabeth vanished, she had dug 2 shallow graves in a wooded area behind her house. She hadn't picked a specific victim at the time. She simply wanted to kill someone. On the evening of October 21st, when she saw Elizabeth walking home alone, she made her move. She approached the little girl and invited her into the woods, saying they could hang out and play. Elizabeth, trusting and unaware of any danger, agreed. Once they were deep in the trees, Alyssa attacked her. She strangled Elizabeth with her hands, slit her throat with a knife, and stabbed her several times for good measure. Then she dragged the child's body to one of the pre-dug graves and buried her there. Afterward, she walked home, cleaned herself up, and acted like nothing had happened. Police immediately secured the crime scene and followed Alyssa's directions to the grave. There, in the cold October soil, they found the lifeless body of Elizabeth Olton, exactly where Alyssa had said it would be. The community's worst fears were confirmed. A little girl had been murdered, not by a stranger, but by someone from their own neighborhood. Someone who had helped search for her. A 15-year-old girl who had killed simply to know what it felt like. The case stunned everyone. Residents, law enforcement, even seasoned detectives. The idea that a teenager could commit such a calculated and brutal act was nearly impossible to understand. What drove Alyssa Bustamante to this point? How could someone so young harbor such violent urges? And why Elizabeth? In the days that followed, investigators continued piecing together the events leading up to the murder. They reviewed Alyssa's internet history and found more disturbing evidence. She had researched things like how to kill someone, and what does it feel like to kill. Her YouTube page showed videos of her and her brothers playing in the woods near the gravesite. In one video, she's seen laughing while telling the camera, "This is where we dig our graves." As authorities built their case, the town of St. Martin tried to make sense of the unthinkable. A young child was gone. A teenager had admitted to killing her, and a once quiet town was now marked by a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The legal process was just beginning, but one thing was already certain. The life of Elizabeth Olton had been stolen in the most senseless, heartbreaking way imaginable. And the person responsible was someone no one had ever suspected. In the days following Alyssa Bustamante's shocking confession, the atmosphere in St. Martin shifted from panic to disbelief. The truth was out, but it didn't make anything easier to accept. A 15-year-old girl had brutally murdered her 9-year-old neighbor, Elizabeth Olton, and buried her in a shallow grave. The community struggled to understand how such darkness could exist behind the doors of an ordinary-looking home. Behind the face of a teenager, law enforcement began to assemble a clearer picture of what had led up to the crime. Alyssa's confession had given them the timeline, the motive, and the chilling level of planning involved. She hadn't acted out of anger or impulse. She had premeditated the murder, selected a victim purely by opportunity, and carried it out with precision. It wasn't about hatred. It was about curiosity, a dark desire to know what it felt like to take a life. Investigators combed through her diaries, sketchbooks, and computer history. In her personal writings, Alyssa had poured out her thoughts without filter. There were pages describing death fantasies, references to suicide, and repeated expressions of boredom and emotional numbness. What disturbed investigators most was the cold way she described the killing itself. She didn't just admit to it. She relived it on paper, with words that seemed more fascinated than remorseful. She described the moment of death as amazing. She even wrote about how the experience had made her feel alive. Police also took note of the 2 graves Alyssa had dug before the murder. They were close together, and no one was certain why there were 2. Some believed she had considered killing again or possibly targeting more than one victim. That theory was never confirmed, but it only added to the sense of danger she posed. Prosecutors now had enough evidence to charge her not just with murder, but with premeditated first-degree murder, a charge that, despite her age, would bring very adult consequences. As news of the crime spread beyond Missouri, media outlets picked up the story. Headlines focused on the shocking contrast between the ages of the victim and the killer. This wasn't a case of gang violence or a random street crime. It was a small-town child, lured by someone she likely trusted, and murdered in cold blood. The public's reaction was swift and intense. People wanted answers. How could a 15-year-old girl be capable of something so brutal? Where were the warning signs? Those close to Alyssa knew she had emotional struggles. Her family life was difficult. Her mother battled addiction and was mostly absent. Her father was serving time in prison. Her grandparents, who had taken her in, tried to create stability in her life, but even they admitted later that Alyssa had been difficult to manage. She had attempted suicide in the past and was under psychiatric care. She was on antidepressants, had been hospitalized for mental health treatment, and had a long history of self-harm. She was known to cut herself and had even encouraged friends to do the same. But no one, teachers, counselors, or family, ever thought she might be a threat to others. Despite her troubled background, the legal system had to make a decision. Should she be treated as a child or as an adult? The nature of the crime left little room for leniency. Prosecutors argued that Alyssa had made a conscious, well-planned choice to commit murder, and that she had shown no real remorse. Because of this, the state decided to try her as an adult. She was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. From that point on, the justice process began to move forward with full force. While legal proceedings began, Elizabeth Olten's family was left trying to cope with unimaginable grief. Her mother, Patty Price, later described how her life stopped the moment Elizabeth went missing. Every detail of that night, waiting by the window, calling out into the dark, begging for her daughter's return, remained burned into her memory. When Elizabeth was found, the grief turned into something heavier. Patty was forced to sit in courtrooms and hear the terrible details of her daughter's final moments. Details no parent should ever have to listen to. There was no real comfort, no justice that could fill the space Elizabeth once filled. The town of St. Martin remained in mourning. People who once left their doors unlocked now turned to security systems. Parents who used to let their kids walk alone began escorting them everywhere. The illusion of safety was gone. The school counselors were brought in to speak with students. Teachers were trained on how to handle conversations around the case. It was hard to heal when the crime had happened so close to home, committed by someone so young. As Alyssa sat in a juvenile detention center awaiting trial, her defense team began preparing their case. They didn't deny that she had committed the crime. Her confession and the physical evidence were too strong. But they aimed to build a picture of a mentally unstable girl with a traumatic background and no support system. Their strategy was to push for a sentence that allowed for rehabilitation rather than lifelong punishment. They painted Alyssa as a product of her environment, a deeply depressed, emotionally numb teenager whose untreated mental illness had spiraled out of control. Still, the prosecution stood firm. They pointed to her premeditation, the planning of the graves, the detailed writings, and the joy she expressed after the murder. They called it evil, calculated, and chilling. Alyssa wasn't just sick, they argued. She was dangerous. Through it all, Alyssa remained mostly silent in the courtroom. Her appearance didn't help her case in the eyes of the public. With dark eyeliner, dyed hair, and a blank expression, she looked more like a rebellious teen than a remorseful one. But it was what she had written, those pages of cold, emotionless reflection on taking a life, that stayed with people the most. Her words had the power to horrify even the most seasoned investigators. As both sides prepared for trial, the weight of what had happened began to settle in. A little girl was gone forever. A family was broken beyond repair. And a teenager, once just another face in the hallway at school, now sat behind bars, facing the reality of spending the rest of her life in prison. In the end, the community's question remained. Was this preventable? Could better mental health treatment have made a difference? Should someone have seen the warning signs earlier? Or was Alyssa Bustamante always capable of violence, hidden behind the mask of a quiet teenager? The legal outcome was approaching. But no matter what the final sentence would be, nothing could erase the horror of what had already happened. For St. Martin, and for the Olton family, the damage was done. The justice system would take its course, but healing would take much longer. By the time Alyssa Bustamante's case reached court in 2012, the small community of St. Martin, Missouri, had been carrying the weight of Elizabeth Olton's murder for more than 2 years. What had once been a town built on routine and trust had been transformed by trauma. Families remained cautious. Children were no longer allowed to roam freely. The Olton family, shattered and grieving, continued to search for meaning in a world that no longer made sense. And now, all eyes were on the courtroom, waiting to see how justice would be served. The prosecution had made it clear from the beginning. This was not a moment of rage, not a spontaneous act of violence, but a calculated murder. Alyssa Bustamante had planned it. She had dug 2 graves in advance. She had selected her victim at random, simply because Elizabeth was young, vulnerable, and nearby. In her own words, Alyssa killed because she wanted to know what it felt like. That motive, cold and detached, had disturbed everyone involved in the case. Her confession had been detailed. In it, she described luring Elizabeth into the woods on the pretense of playing, taking her to a remote spot near her home, and then attacking her without warning. She had strangled the child until she lost consciousness, then used a knife to slit her throat and stab her. She buried her in one of the shallow graves she had dug days earlier. The other grave remained unused. It was a level of planning and control that prosecutors said could not be ignored, even considering her age. During the hearings, the prosecution presented more of Alyssa's writings, entries from her diary that were both graphic and emotionless. The most infamous entry was written the day after the murder. In it, she casually wrote about the killing, describing the sensation as amazing and noting how pretty enjoyable the whole thing was once she got over the initial fear. Then, without pause, she closed the entry by saying she needed to go to church, punctuating it with LOL. These words were read aloud in court. They silenced the room. For Elizabeth's family, it was an unbearable moment. Her mother, Patty Price, was visibly shaken. No parent should ever have to hear such things about the death of their child, let alone from the killer's own hand, documented with such indifference. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for mercy. They did not try to deny Alyssa's guilt. Instead, they focused on her age, her mental health, and the deeply unstable environment in which she had been raised. They pointed to a long history of depression, self-harm, and suicidal behavior. Alyssa had attempted suicide multiple times, been hospitalized for psychiatric care, and was on medication at the time of the murder. Her family life had been fractured from the beginning, her mother battling drug addiction, her father serving time in prison. Her grandparents had stepped in, but the emotional damage had already taken root. Her defense attorneys argued that Alyssa was not evil, she was broken. A teenager with severe emotional issues, untreated trauma, and a desperate cry for help that no one fully recognized until it was too late. They asked the court to consider the possibility of rehabilitation. She was, after all, still just a child when she committed the crime. In the end, Alyssa made a deal with prosecutors. Rather than go through a full trial and risk a mandatory life sentence without parole, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. It was a strategic move. The court accepted her plea, and in 2012, Alyssa Bustamante was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for the second charge. The sentencing hearing was emotional. Patty Price spoke through tears, describing the lasting pain her family had endured and the deep scar left by Elizabeth's absence. Her voice broke as she said that no punishment could ever bring her daughter back. No amount of prison time could undo what had been done. She had lost not just a child, but a future, birthdays, school plays, and years of memories that would never be made. Alyssa, now 18, sat silently through the hearing. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood and spoke briefly. Her words were soft, difficult to hear. She apologized to Elizabeth's family. "I know words," she said, "can never be enough, and they can never undo what I've done. I'm sorry." But for the Olton family, those words meant little. The damage was too great, the act too horrific, and the memory too fresh. Alyssa was taken away to begin serving her sentence in a Missouri women's correctional facility. Though eligible for parole one day, the timeline is long. She would spend many years behind bars before any such review would even be considered. For the community, the conclusion of a case brought some closure, but no peace. The impact of the murder stretched beyond two families. It reached classmates, neighbors, teachers, and law enforcement officers who had worked the case. The community of St. Martin had to live with the reality that something like this had happened in their midst. That a child had killed another child, not in a moment of confusion or self-defense, but with intent, forethought, and chilling detachment. The case became a focal point in discussions about juvenile justice. Many questioned whether teens who commit such crimes should ever be treated as adults. Others argued that the nature of the crime, not the age of the offender, should dictate the punishment. Alyssa Bustamante's name was added to the long, troubling list of youthful offenders who committed acts so violent they shook the legal and ethical foundations of the juvenile system. Years later, the crime is still remembered. In a town where people once felt so safe, the woods where Elizabeth's body was found remain a symbol of heartbreak. Her grave is often visited, decorated with flowers and keepsakes. Her family keeps her memory alive through photos, stories, and public tributes. For some, the case serves as a grim reminder of the importance of mental health intervention. Had Alyssa received more effective treatment? Could this have been prevented? Was there a moment, just one, when someone could have seen how far she had slipped? The questions remain, but the facts are permanent. A young girl named Elizabeth Olton walked home one evening and never returned. Her life was taken by someone she knew, another child. One plagued by darkness no one fully understood in time. And though the trial is over, the story continues to haunt all those it touched.